The world for Silas Blackwood is one of hard-packed earth, the smell of pine on a dry wind, and the profound, aching silence of a man long alone. He moves through it with the economy of someone who knows that every wasted motion is a calorie he might need later. Today, that deliberate pace brings him along the neglected track bordering the old Thorn property, a patch of dust and rock that has broken better men than the poor soul who last tried to tame it. It's the sound that stops him, thin and sharp as a shard of glass against the vast quiet. A boy's voice, stretched taut with a pain too old for its years. Silas reins in his mare, Clementine, her ears twitching towards the sound. He listens, his own stillness a part of the landscape. The words come again, a desperate chant aimed at the uncaring sky. Mama's spine shattered, can't take the agony. Danger's close, and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. The cry came from a sod-roofed cabin listing to one side, as if weary of its own existence. It was a place Silas had passed 100 times, noting the slow decay, the losing battle against the elements. He hadn't known anyone was still living there. He dismounted, the leather of his saddle groaning in protest. Every instinct, honed by years of minding his own business, told him to ride on. It wasn't his trouble, but the image of his own mother, her face pale and drawn in her final years, flickered behind his eyes. He tied Clementine to a withered fence post and walked towards the cabin, his boots scuffing up clouds of pale dirt. The door was ajar. Peeking through the gap, he saw a scene of stark desperation. A small boy, no older than 9, with hair the color of sun-bleached straw, was trying to spoon water between the lips of a woman laid out on a crude straw mattress. The woman's face was a mask of suffering, her skin stretched tight over her bones, her eyes closed against a world that had become nothing but pain. The boy looked up, his eyes wide and terrified as Silas's shadow fell across the floor. And with the simple, heavy act of stepping over the threshold, Silas Blackwood's solitary world was irrevocably shattered. He had learned their story in broken pieces, some from the boy, Finn, and some from the faint, breathless whispers of the mother, Elara. Her husband, a hopeful farmer named Thomas, had died of a fever the previous spring. Elara, determined to hold on to their small homestead for her son, had worked herself to the bone. The accident had been as simple as it was catastrophic. A loose rung on the barn loft ladder. A fall. A sound like a dry branch snapping. Since then, she had not walked. She had not known a moment without the fire that licked its way up and down her spine. Silas, a man who spoke more with his hands than his mouth, started with the practical. He chopped a mountain of firewood, enough to last a month, the rhythmic thud of his axe a steady heartbeat in the desolate quiet. He hauled buckets of water from the nearly dry creek, his shoulders straining with the yoke. He rode to town and came back with a sack of flour, salted pork, and a small jar of laudanum from the doctor, who had listened to his description of Alara's condition with a grim, pitying shake of his head. He placed the goods on the rickety table without a word, feeling the weight of Alara's stare. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were filled with a fierce, painful pride. "We can't pay you," she rasped, her voice rough from disuse and agony. "Didn't ask for pay," Silas replied, not looking at her. He busied himself checking the leaky roof. Finn, however, shadowed his every move. The boy's initial terror had been replaced by a cautious, watchful curiosity. He saw the way Silas moved, the quiet competence in his hands as he patched a worn-out boot or coaxed a flame from damp kindling. He saw the gentleness in those same calloused hands when he adjusted the thin blanket over his mother. For Finn, who had been the sole man of the house for months, Silas was a figure of impossible strength. The town of Redemption Creek was a place that lived up to only half its name. It offered redemption to those who already had a foothold, but for those slipping, it offered only the creek, a current of judgment that could pull a soul under. Silas felt it when he bought the supplies. The sideways glances from Martha, the storekeeper. The low murmur between two ranchers near the pickle barrel. He'd heard whispers about the Thorn widow, left to rot on that useless plot of land. Jebediah Thorn, the man who owned half the county, was known for his cold arithmetic. He had leased the land to Alara's husband, and Silas knew Thorn would consider the widow and her boy to be nothing more than a failed investment he needed to clear from his books. That thought settled like a stone in his gut. The days bled into a routine. Silas would ride over from his own small, struggling ranch at dawn and leave at dusk. He'd do the heavy work Alara couldn't, the work Finn was too small for. He'd sit for a spell while Finn read to his mother from a tattered book of poems, the boy's earnest voice a small candle against the encroaching darkness of her pain. In those quiet moments, Silas learned more. He saw the intelligence in Alara's eyes, the way she would correct Finn's pronunciation with a soft murmur. He saw the ghost of the woman she had been, strong, capable, full of life. It made her current state all the more profane. The first true test came in the form of a late autumn storm that blew in with the fury of a cornered animal. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind howled around the little cabin, threatening to peel the sod from its roof. Silas had been about to leave for the day, but one look at the sky and Finn's frightened face told him he was staying the night. That night was a descent into a private hell. The cold and the damp seeped into Alara's bones, turning the fire in her spine into a raging inferno. She tried to stifle her moans for Finn's sake, biting down on her lip until it bled, but the pain was a living thing that clawed its way out of her. Silas sat in the corner, helpless, listening to the symphony of her suffering and the desperate, whispered reassurances from her son. He felt like an intruder, a witness to a grief so profound it felt sacred. He built up the fire, made broth she couldn't drink, and did the only thing he could think of. He stayed. He bore witness. Morning came, pale and exhausted. The storm had passed, leaving a clean, cold world in its wake. Alara was spent, her face ashen, her breathing shallow. As Silas looked at her, so fragile and broken, and then at Finn, whose small shoulders carried the weight of the world, something inside him shifted. The detached compassion he'd felt hardened into a fierce, unyielding resolve. This wasn't charity anymore. It was a duty. As if summoned by the change in the air, a wagon appeared on the horizon, moving steadily towards the cabin. Silas recognized it instantly. Jebediah Thorne's polished buggy, drawn by two fine black horses, was an obscene display of wealth in this landscape of poverty. Finn saw it too. "It's Mr. Thorne," he whispered, his voice trembling. "He says we have to leave. He says Mama's a liability." Silas looked from the approaching wagon to the woman on the mattress. He saw the terror that flickered in her eyes, a fear that went beyond physical pain. The fear of being cast out, of being left to die on the open prairie with her child. He walked to the door and stood on the small, warped porch, positioning himself between the cabin and the coming threat. Thorne pulled his horses to a halt, a look of sour annoyance on his face when he saw Silas. "Blackwood, what are you doing on my property?" "Just visiting a neighbor," Silas said, his voice level. "This ain't a neighbor, it's a squatter," Thorne sneered, gesturing with his whip towards the cabin. "The lease was with the husband. He's dead. She's useless. They've had more than enough time to clear out." Silas didn't move. He felt Finn come to stand just behind him, a small hand gripping the back of his worn coat. He could feel the boy's tremors. In that moment, the vague sense of duty coalesced into a vow, silent but absolute. He looked past Thorne, at the endless, indifferent horizon, and then back at the man's cruel, pinched face. "They're dead," Silas said, his voice low but carrying with the weight of an oath. "The work, her care, it's all mine now. I'll take it on." Thorne stared, then let out a short, ugly laugh. "You'll take it on? You can barely manage that pitiful patch of rocks you call a ranch. You're a fool, Blackwood. You'll be burying her by Christmas, and this land will be mine to lease to someone who can actually work it." "Get off this land, Thorne," Silas said, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "It's under my protection now." For a long moment, the two men locked eyes. Thorne, accustomed to bullying and bluster, found something in Silas's quiet gaze that he couldn't break. With a curse, he yanked on the reins, turning his buggy around in a spray of mud and contempt. As he rode away, Silas remained standing there, a silent guardian at the door of a broken house, the weight of his promise settling onto his shoulders like a winter cloak. The journey from Alara's dilapidated homestead to Silas's ranch was a slow, agonizing procession. He had fitted his wagon with every blanket and pillow he owned, creating a soft nest to cushion her from the jarring ruts of the track. Even so, every bump and sway drew a sharp, indrawn breath from her. Finn sat beside her, holding her hand, his face a small, stoic mask that mirrored Silas's own. Silas drove the team with excruciating care, his knuckles white on the reins, his focus absolute. He was already living his vow, feeling every jolt as if it were a blow to his own body. His cabin was not much larger than hers, but it was sound. The walls were chinked tight against the wind, the stone fireplace drew clean, and the floor was made of solid, planed wood. He had spent 2 days preparing, moving his own cot into the small lean-to where he stored his tack, and placing a proper bed frame, a luxury he'd bought on credit, in the main room for Alara. She protested, her voice weak but laced with iron. "I will not take your bed. The floor is fine." "You'll take the bed," Silas stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. He lifted her from the wagon, his arms surprisingly gentle. She weighed almost nothing, a bird with broken wings. As he laid her down, her head fell back against the pillow, and a single tear escaped from the corner of her eye, tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. It was not a tear of gratitude, he knew, but one of profound humiliation. The first weeks were a trial of patience and restraint. Alara was a prisoner in her own body, and her frustration often manifested as a sharp, biting pride. She fought his help at every turn, refusing food, insisting she could manage tasks that were impossible for her. Silas learned to navigate her moods as a sailor learns the currents. He never argued. He would simply leave the plate of food by her bed, or quietly clean up a spilled cup of water without comment. He gave her dignity by pretending not to see her defeats. Finn, on the other hand, began to thrive. Under Silas's quiet tutelage, he learned to set a snare, to mend a fence, to read the weather in the clouds. The haunted, fearful look in his eyes was slowly replaced by the bright curiosity of a boy learning his world. He was the bridge between the two silent adults. He would relay his mother's observations about the way Silas managed his small herd of cattle, or he would tell his mother about the funny way Clementine would nudge Silas's pockets, looking for a treat. It was through Finn's reading that Silas made a discovery. One evening, as Finn stumbled over a passage about accounting in a dry book about homesteading, Alara corrected him automatically. "No, Finn. The debit goes on the left, the credit on the right. Assets equal liabilities plus equity." Silas looked up from the harness he was mending. Her eyes were clear and focused. The fog of pain momentarily lifted. The next day, he brought her his messy ledger, a chaotic collection of numbers and receipts he could barely make sense of himself. "I'd be obliged if you'd look at this," he said gruffly, setting it on the small table he'd built to slide over her bed. "My figuring's not so good." For the first time since he'd met her, Alara looked at him with something other than pain or suspicion. She saw a genuine request, an acknowledgement of a skill she still possessed. Hesitantly, she opened the book. For the next week, she worked, her brow furrowed in concentration. She filled pages with neat columns of figures, her mind finding a refuge from her body's prison. She discovered debts Silas had forgotten and potential income he hadn't considered. She was not just a patient, she was a partner. As the land hardened with the first deep frosts, a fragile peace settled over the small cabin. They developed a rhythm. The scrape of Silas's boots on the porch, the murmur of Alara's voice guiding Finn's lessons, the smell of stew simmering on the hearth. Silas found himself looking forward to the evenings, to the quiet companionship that filled the warm space. He would watch her as she worked on the ledgers, her face illuminated by the firelight, and feel a protective ache in his chest that had nothing to do with duty. He was beginning to see the woman, not the wound. But the outside world could not be kept at bay forever. A trip into Redemption Creek for supplies was a harsh reminder of their isolation. Thorne had been busy poisoning the well. Whispers followed Silas down the town's main street. Lives in sin with a cripple, trying to steal that land, ought to be ashamed. Men who had once nodded to him now turned their backs. Martha, the storekeeper, served him with pursed lips and counted his change twice. Silas absorbed the scorn with his usual stoicism, his face an unreadable mask. But the poison found its way back to the ranch. A neighbor, riding the fence line, made a crude remark that Finn overheard. The boy came back to the cabin, his face pale, and refused to say what was wrong. But later that night, Silas heard Alara quietly crying in her bed. The sound was more devastating than any of her moans of pain. He went to her side, a bulky, awkward shadow in the moonlight. "What is it?" he asked. "You should send us away," she whispered, her voice thick with shame. "I am ruining you. Your name. Your life. My name's my own to worry about," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "And my life is my own to live." "But they're right," she choked out. "I am a burden. A useless, broken thing." He knelt by the bed, forcing her to look at him. His face was grim, his jaw set. "You are the one who figured out how I can save this ranch. You are the one teaching your son to be a good man. You are the strongest person I have ever known. The only thing broken is your body, Alara, not you." He had never spoken so many words to her at once. They hung in the air between them, a declaration more profound than his initial vow. He saw the shock in her eyes, followed by a dawning, fragile hope. He had defended her not just from Thorn, but from her own despair. In that moment, the line between protector and protected blurred. They were simply two people, weathering the same storm, together. The arrival of Doc Miller was preceded by the clatter of his buggy and the sound of his long-suffering horse, sighing, as it was pulled to a halt. He was a gruff, pragmatic man whose bedside manner was notoriously lacking, but his hands were skilled and his heart, most folks agreed, was in the right place. He entered the cabin, bringing with him the scent of antiseptic and winter air. He examined Alara with a series of gentle, probing touches, his face giving nothing away. Silas stood by the fire, twisting his hat in his hands, while Finn watched from the corner, his small body rigid with anxiety. After a long silence, the doctor straightened up, his expression grim. "The damage is severe, just as I suspected," he said, his voice low. "The vertebrae are crushed. By all rights, she shouldn't have survived the fall." He looked at Alara, a flicker of professional admiration in his eyes. "Your will to live must be something fierce, ma'am." A familiar shadow of despair began to fall over the room, but the doctor held up a hand. "However," he continued slowly, "I was at a medical conference in Denver last year. I heard a surgeon there, a man named Albright. He's been experimenting with a new procedure, rebuilding the spine, using pins and steel braces. It's dangerous, it's expensive, and it's a long shot." Hope, sudden and blinding, pierced the gloom. "You mean she could walk again?" Silas asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I mean there's a chance," the doctor corrected. "A slim one. And the cost, it would be more than this ranch is worth, Silas. You'd need to get her to a hospital in St. Louis. The travel alone would be a trial." The hope receded, leaving an even colder emptiness behind. St. Louis was another world. The money was an impossible dream. But the seed had been planted. The idea that this wasn't a life sentence, that there was a chance for a future beyond this room, changed everything. That night, Alara's mind, freed by that sliver of possibility, worked with a feverish intensity. With Silas sitting beside her, she went over the ledgers again, her fingers tracing the columns of figures that represented their life. "It's not enough," she said, her voice flat with disappointment. "Even if we sold every head of cattle, it wouldn't be half of what we'd need." Silas stared into the fire, the weight of his promise pressing down on him. He had sworn to bear her suffering, but he was powerless against this. He could mend fences and chop wood, but he could not conjure a fortune from the dust. Then Alara's eyes lit with a different kind of fire. "Wait," she whispered, pulling a crumpled map from the ledger. It was a territory map, showing the forts and settlements. "Here, Fort Grant. The Army puts out a beef contract every winter. They pay a premium because the drive is treacherous this time of year. No one wants to risk it." She looked at him, her eyes wide and brilliant. "It's a gamble, Silas. A terrible one. You could lose the whole herd in a blizzard. You could." She couldn't bring herself to say the words. He looked at the map, then at her. He saw the desperate, brilliant plan taking shape. It was a mad risk, but it was their only one. "We'll do it," he said, the decision settling in him, solid and sure. Their plan, however, had a more immediate enemy than winter or distance. Jebediah Thorn had not been idle. A few days later, the sheriff, a weary man named Elias Vance, rode out to the ranch. He didn't dismount, just looked down at Silas from his saddle with an expression of regret. Silas, Thorne filed a formal complaint. He's claiming you're on his property under false pretenses. He says you're cohabiting with the widow without the sanction of marriage, and that makes any agreement you have for the lease null and void. He has a writ of eviction. The word struck Silas like a physical blow. Thorne was using the town's morality as a weapon, twisting Silas's compassion into something sordid and shameful to get what he wanted. You know that's not what this is, Elias, Silas said, his voice tight. What I know don't matter much against what the law says, the sheriff sighed. He's coming tomorrow morning with 2 deputies to serve the papers. I'm telling you as a courtesy. I'd advise you to have the woman and her boy packed and ready to go. He tipped his hat and rode off, leaving Silas standing alone in the cold, the world shrinking to the 4 walls of the cabin behind him. He was about to lose everything. The ranch, the chance for Alara's surgery, the fragile family he had built. The fight was no longer about a distant future. It was about surviving the next 24 hours. The morning dawned cold and gray, the sky the color of old iron. A tense, brittle silence had fallen over the cabin. Finn sat by the hearth, polishing a piece of wood into the shape of a horse, his small face a study in concentration, as if he could carve away his fear. Silas had spent the night staring into the dying embers of the fire, his mind a battlefield. He could run, take Alara and Finn and disappear into the territories. But that would mean giving up, confirming every lie Thorne had spread. It would mean surrendering the only home they had, the only hope for Alara's future. No, he would not run. He would make his stand here. He did one thing. He asked Alara to help Finn dress in his best, threadbare clothes. He then carefully, gently, lifted her from her bed and placed her in the sturdy wooden armchair he'd repaired, wrapping her in his thickest wool blanket. He pushed the chair close to the open doorway, so she could see out onto the porch. She didn't ask why. She simply watched him, her stormy eyes filled with a terrifying trust. Just after dawn, they arrived. Thorne's polished buggy led the way, followed by Sheriff Vance and 2 grim-faced deputies on horseback. They stopped a few yards from the cabin, an intimidating line of authority and malice. Blackwood, Thorne's voice was triumphant. Your time is up. The sheriff has the writ. You will remove this woman and her child from my property. Now, Silas stepped out onto the porch, positioning himself in front of Alara's chair. He was not armed, save for the hunting knife on his belt. His hands were empty and steady at his sides. This is her home, Thorne, and mine. It's my land. Thorne snarled, his face turning ruddy with anger. And I won't have it befouled by the likes of you. Living in sin, a disgrace to this community, he spat on the ground. Sheriff, do your duty. Sheriff Vance dismounted, the eviction notice held stiffly in his hand. His eyes were full of apology, but his steps were firm. This was the moment of defeat. Silas could feel Finn press against the back of his legs, seeking shelter. Then, a voice, quiet but clear as a bell, came from the chair. He is not living in sin, Mr. Thorne. All eyes turned to Alara. Her face was pale, her body frail, but her spine, the one that mattered, was ramrod straight. He is living by a code of honor you could never comprehend. You speak of disgrace? You, who let my husband work this land to death, and then sought to throw his grieving family out into the winter. You, who preys on the weak and calls it business. Thorne was momentarily speechless, taken aback by the venom and dignity in her voice. Finn, emboldened by his mother, stepped out from behind Silas. You're a bad man, he shouted, his small voice cracking. Silas is good. He's taking care of us. Thorne recovered, his lips twisting into a sneer. The sentimental cries of a boy and a cripple change nothing. The law is the law. They are not family. Sheriff. Sheriff Vance took another step forward, his duty warring with his conscience. Silas, I'm sorry. Wait, Silas said. His voice was calm, cutting through the tension. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat. He did not pull out a weapon. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to the sheriff. I believe you'll find the law is on our side. The sheriff unfolded the paper. His eyes widened as he read. He looked from the document to Silas, then to Alara, a slow understanding dawning on his face. He cleared his throat. Well, I'll be. What is it? Thorne demanded, his impatience growing. The sheriff looked Thorne directly in the eye. It's a marriage certificate. Signed and sealed by Circuit Judge Miller 2 days ago. According to this, Silas Blackwood and Alara Miller were legally wed. He looked back at Silas. You're her husband. Silas met his gaze. That's right. He then turned his eyes to Alara, a question and a statement all in one. He is my husband, Alara affirmed, her voice ringing with unshakable conviction. Silas looked back at the stunned group. Her suffering is mine because her life is mine. Her home is mine. And by law, this homestead lease belongs to my wife and me. Now, I believe you are the one trespassing, Thorn. The declaration hung in the cold air, irrefutable. The legal ground Thorn stood on had crumbled to dust beneath his feet. The deputies shifted uncomfortably. The sheriff, with a look of profound relief, slowly, deliberately, tore the eviction writ in half and let the pieces flutter to the ground. Mr. Thorn, Sheriff Vance said, his voice now cold and official. I'd suggest you get back in your buggy and leave this family in peace. Shamed, defeated, and utterly outmaneuvered, Thorn stared at them, his face a mask of impotent fury. Without another word, he climbed back into his buggy and rode away, his departure a cloud of dust and humiliation. The deputies, with nods to Silas, followed the sheriff back towards town. And then there was silence. The vast, peaceful silence of the prairie returned, broken only by the sigh of the wind. Silas, Finn, and Alara were left alone in front of their home, a small, defiant island in the immense landscape. The threat was gone. They had won. In the quiet aftermath, the world seemed to hold its breath. Silas turned from watching the last of the dust settle and knelt beside Alara's chair. The raw courage of the confrontation had left them both drained, their shared victory a fragile, shimmering thing in the cool air. He reached out and took her hand. It was cold, but it did not tremble. She looked from their joined hands to the torn pieces of paper on the ground, then up to his face. Her stormy eyes were soft now, awash with unshed tears that, for the first time, were not born of pain or despair. The certificate, she whispered, her voice husky. Did you mean it, Silas? He met her gaze, his own eyes holding an ocean of unspoken emotion. He had done it to protect her, to give them a legal shield. But the words he'd spoken in front of the sheriff had been truer than any legal document. Every word, he said, his voice low and certain. A single tear finally traced a path down her cheek, but this time, it was a tear of release, of overwhelming, terrifying hope. He had not only borne her suffering, he had claimed her life as his own, wrapping her in a protection so absolute it had vanquished their demons. She squeezed his hand, a silent acceptance, a vow of her own. Finn came and stood beside the chair, leaning his head against his mother's shoulder, his small hand resting on top of theirs. A complete circle, the three of them against the world. The cabin behind them was no longer just a shelter. It was a home, consecrated by their shared stand. The money for the surgery in St. Louis was still a distant dream, the dangerous cattle drive still a necessity looming on the horizon. The future was still a vast, unmapped territory, but it was no longer a place of fear. Now, it was a place they would journey to together. Silas looked at Alara's face, softened by the morning light, and at the son who looked at him with such open trust. The promise he had made on a desperate afternoon had transformed. It was no longer a burden to be carried, but a life to be shared. He gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead, his touch a quiet testament to a love forged in hardship and sealed in defiance. In the immense quiet of the prairie, their clasped hands were the only anchor they needed, a silent promise of a future waiting to be built. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. He made a compassionate choice that changed lives. Do you think more people should act on such instincts? Share your thoughts.